Good morning, everybody. I'm Councillor Andrew Brown. For the benefit of those watching remotely, I'll be chairing this meeting of the Planning Policy and Built Heritage Working Party for October. For anyone who hasn't viewed or attended these meetings before, the officers sit to the left and right of me on the top table, and the members who will be making decisions on the agenda items are sat in front of me. If I could start, please, by asking officers to introduce themselves, starting with the officers on my left.
Morning, I'm Mark Ashwell. I'm the Planning Policy Manager.
I'm Rakesh Tolivar. I produce the AMR.
I'm Russell Williams. I'm the Assistant Director for Planning at North Norfolk District Council.
And Lauren Gregory, Democratic Services Officer.
Thank you very much for that. So I'd like to welcome members of the public who are viewing this remotely, hopefully this morning. Before we start the formal business, can I just advise you that we're not expecting a fire alarm this morning, so if there is one, it's for real. I think most people in this room know the drill for that. And if I could make a plea for people to either switch off their mobiles or mute them, please, before we start. So having said all of that, if we move to the agenda, Lauren, item 1, apologies for absence. I believe we've got Councillor Bull and Councillor Hankins. Are there any other?
No, that's correct, Chairman. Councillor Bull and Hankins have submitted their apologies. There are no substitute members in attendance.
Thank you very much. Item 2, public questions. I believe we don't have any.
None received.
Thank you very much. So we move to the minutes of the meeting, item 3 of the September meeting of the Working Party, which is at page 1. So if we just go through this for accuracy only, page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4. I think we just have a slight amendment. There's perhaps a missing word in line 3 of the paragraph, the final paragraph on page 4. I think we should have the word affected so that it reads NNDC would not be affected having submitted its local plan. So just a missing verb there from that line. So subject to that, can I have a proposer for the minutes? Councillor Varley, and a seconder, please. Councillor Dixon. All those in favour? Passed unanimously, I think. Right. So we should go back to the agenda. Items of urgent business. I don't believe we have any of those. Declarations of interest, pecuniary or otherwise. We all have the advice in the papers on what we should do. Do I have any members wishing to declare an interest? No. Thank you very much for that. And so we move to item 6, which is the proposed adoption of the Blakeney neighbourhood plan. Who would like to present this? Mr. Ashton.
Yeah, I didn't propose to do a lengthy presentation of this. So the Blakeney neighbourhood plan has now progressed through the various stages of preparation, been subject to local referendum, passed the referendum, and then the next stage for the local authorities to formally make the plan. So there needs to be a formal resolution to essentially they use the term make the plan rather than adopt the plan, but it essentially means the same thing. And when a local council makes a plan, it becomes part of the formal development plan for the district. And at that point, you start attaching weight to the policies in the plan when you're making decisions on planning applications. So that's all in the report, should largely be a formality. I'd be very surprised if you've got any concerns about that. The recommendation is that we recommend to Cabinet that the plan is made, essentially. It's probably worth recording just two areas of policy which are in the Blakeney plan, which will be of certainly interest to yourselves. One is around principal residence restrictions. So we've had lots of debates about what we're going to do or what we should be doing about second homes in North Norfolk. The Blakeney neighbourhood plan is the first plan in the district to have what's called a principal residence restriction on new dwellings. So henceforth, every new dwelling which is built in Blakeney would have to have a principal residence restriction applied to the planning permission, thereby preventing that dwelling from being used as a second home. That's the first plan in the district that's got that policy approach in it. And the second is a requirement that affordable housing is made available solely to people with a local connection being defined as people who live in Blakeney and the adjacent parishes. The importance of that for us is North Norfolk's approach to affordable housing is twofold. On rural exceptions development, that's affordable housing built outside of development boundaries, we apply the local lettings restrictions. So we say priority goes to people in Blakeney and the adjacent parishes on rural exceptions affordable housing. On allocated sites, so Blakeney is a good example, we're allocating a bit of land in the village for housing. The affordable housing that's delivered via allocations is made available for general lettings for anybody on the housing register. So essentially means if you're on the housing register, you're in high levels of need, you can access affordable housing in Blakeney, even if you live in Potter Heigham. So the product is allocated on the basis of need rather than local connection. So that distinction is really important. It gives people on the general lettings register a fair chance of accessing affordable housing across the district rather than being limited to affordable housing which is built in their own community. And clearly, given that we don't build affordable housing in every community across the entirety of the district, people require that general lettings principle in order to access any product, because otherwise it'd be very, very restrictive. So we were concerned about the approach that's now in the Blakeney plan, and it's one we need to keep an eye on. The inspector was persuaded by the banner headline, local homes for local people, and took the view, I think probably because Blakeney Village in the AONB, if it's going to have housing, going to have affordable housing, there ought to be a local connection. Not entirely persuaded that that argument would stack up across the entirety of the district, particularly in bigger communities. If you saw that local restriction being applied, say in Cromer or Wells or North Walsham, or a larger town where there was lots of affordable housing being provided, to make that available exclusively for people that already live there would be a problem for those that don't live there and couldn't access the product. So it's one to watch. Anyway, the authority's got little option other than to make the plan. It's been through examination. The inspector's reached his conclusions, and the recommendation is that we endorse those conclusions and recommend to Cabinet. Take any questions. It may have created some confusion there.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Yeah, we have a window of opportunity as well, don't we? We have to adopt it within 8 weeks of the referendum date, which was on the 14th of September. So that would take us to the 10th of November, which I think we don't have another working party before that. So that's why we're dealing with it today, and why it's had to come to the meeting today. So this is, I think I'm right in saying, is the 4th neighbourhood plan. So this would make a quartet following on from Holt, Great Ryborough and Corpus de Saxthorpe. And we've got another one in the pipeline. Councillor Fisher is nodding his head, I see, because he knows what I'm going to say, in Wells next to the sea, which is coming on stream. I presume is there a similar local lettings flavour to the Wells next to the sea, or we're not sure? or don't we know at the moment?
I'm not sure, so I'm not.
Yeah, I know
don't-
it's not
Yeah,
Principally your
yeah.
area of.
I think, I mean, the Blakeney decision has been watched elsewhere in the district, and I know there are other rural sort of coastal communities who are looking at neighbourhood planning as a vehicle for principally looking at that principal residence restriction. It wouldn't surprise me if the Blakeney decision led to some of the other parishes along that coastal strip taking a view that there's now, more value in preparing a neighbourhood plan than perhaps there previously was. So as I say, it wouldn't surprise me if we've got some others.
And its effect will be marginal. I think if we stress that it's on new buildings only, so this will not, as it were, regulate already built property on a local occupancy basis, will it, moving forward? So
No,
it's a marginal measure.
It'll relate to the 30 or 40 new build properties that are built in Blakeney over the next sort of 15 or 20 years. It doesn't bite on those properties which are already in use as second homes, and it doesn't affect those dwellings which exist and change to second homes, because as of today, that does not need planning permission. So its impact is limited solely to new build properties in the village. And that was one of the sort of reasons why we looked at it as part of local plan preparation, but took the view that it wouldn't be an effective mechanism because it could only bite on a relatively small part of the housing stock, couldn't touch the other 95% of houses which already exist.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yes, I'll move to members now for questions. Councillor Toy and then Councillor Holiday.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm sure officers will, but presumably they know the boundaries and will make it clear to us if an application comes forward. Obviously, we know the allocated site, but when we're in development committee, they will make it clear if it fits within that plan boundary.
The committee reports now, well, once the plan is made, will have to quote the policy context of the neighbourhood plan alongside our own policies and resolve any conflicts between the two. There will be areas where a discussion will be had about which of the two policies should get most weight. Traditional view would be the last adopted plan is the one where you start. So you'd look in the neighbourhood plan, see what that says. You give that weight over and above anything which is in our plan. And then when our new plan is adopted, that balance would tip the other way, and our new plan would take priority over a neighbourhood plan where there were any areas of conflict to be resolved. I don't think that will happen very often, to be honest with you. But you will start getting reports that will quote in the policy context, the policies of Blakeney neighbourhood plan will appear, and then the commentary underneath and the analysis will explain the weight to be attached to those policies where they're different to the ones that we've got. But largely speaking, one of the tests of a neighbourhood plan, it should broadly be in conformity with our plans anyway. So the areas are different, should be relatively marginal, but it will crop up every now and again.
Thank you.
Yes, I think part of the recommendation is that the mapping is amended to take into account the area which is affected by the neighbourhood plan, and then that feeds into the constraints that planning officers receive when they receive an application for validation. So it should all knit together from that point of view.
Yeah,
I think.
sorry. I felt sure that officers would let us know, but it's just that as more and more of these develop, if they've got differences in them, for us that also sit on the development committee, I just want to make sure that was happening, and I guessed it would be, but officers don't let us down in that. But yeah,
it'll operate in a similar way to the officers will confirm whether a property is within a conservation area from the conservation area mapping. So this will operate in a similar way from that point of view. Councillor Holiday.
Thank you. As the member for Blakeney, I just wanted to say there was huge community support for this. 90% of the people who voted were in favour, even though it was a relatively small turnout for various reasons, but there were very few objections. 100% of the population want more affordable housing specifically for local people. So I think that's pretty much a resounding argument for what they've put forward. And 78% of them agree with the limiting number of second homes. So it's given that they've got 43% second homes and holiday lets, I think these are pretty important policies for them, and they obviously feel very strongly about all the policies, not just the second home ones, but the infill ones, the dark skies, and that's all very much evidenced by consultation with the population. So I feel very comfortable with recommending that we go with it. Thank you very much.
Yes, I think you speak for most of us, most of, well, if not all members, when you say that it's, you know, it is welcome to have a principal residence restriction system, limited though it is. I think the game changer will be if government decides to introduce change of use planning measures for, you know, existing properties that probably have an even greater impact, but that remains to be seen as to where we go with that. Councillor Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I note with interest the restrictions that Mark has explained, and I'm sure that in due course we will want to monitor the effectiveness of those, and that information may be helpful to us in deciding other measures that might be appropriate at some stage in the future. So for me, the detail that's in the plan has already been scrutinised and commented on in some detail. So it's passed those tests, and I see no impediment in the process as this is followed. So for me, I'm happy to approve if that's a recommendation or a proposal. Thank you.
Yeah, so you're happy to propose approval of the recommendations. And Councillor Toy will second. Lauren, any further comment before we move to the recommendations as set out? And sorry, but before we go to the recommendation, when we say it will be made, that's for the leader to announce at full council following referral to the cabinet. Is that the journey that this goes on? I think that happened last time, didn't it, with the Holt neighbourhood plan? Just so that we're absolutely sure.
I think the route previously was that the working party recommended to cabinet that the plan is formally made, and that's the decision. It didn't then go on, from my memory, to full council for a resolution.
Maybe my memory is playing tricks. Maybe it was just announced at full council that cabinet had, as it were, made the decision. That might be the route it takes. Right. So we've got the recommendation is members of the Planning Policy and Built Heritage Working Party recommend to cabinet that, having been subject to successful local referendum, the Blakeney neighbourhood plan be made, i.e. brought into force as part of the statutory development plan for North Norfolk in accordance with the statutory recommendation as set out in the papers, as soon as practical and within an 8-week statutory time frame. So that will go to cabinet within the 8 weeks, won't it? So we're sound on that. B, the issuing of the decision statement required under regulation 19 in order to bring to the attention of the qualifying body the people who live, work and carry out business in the neighbourhood plan area, i.e. in Blakeney, is delegated to the Assistant Director of Planning in conjunction with the Planning Policy Team Leader, both of which are present here today. So that ratifies that. And then secondly, acknowledge that the required consequential amendments to the adopted policies map and the required minor consequential changes to the referendum version of the neighbourhood plan through delegated powers to the Planning Policy Team Leader. So we have the proposer and the seconder. All those in favour of these two recommendations, please raise your hands. That seems to be carried unanimously. Thank you. microphone. We move to item 7, publication of the annual monitoring report. And there's a neat segue from what Councillor Dixon was saying. We move to Rakesh's work, presumably monitoring the local lettings policy in the neighbourhood plan will form part of your annual monitoring reports, possibly. But if I can hand over to you, Mark, to present this item.
So what I thought I might do is just quickly present the presentation that's going to appear on the screen. I think you've seen sight of that. Just run through some of the sort of highlights, explain what the annual monitoring report does, and then just take any questions, and I'll try to keep it relatively short. So I'm going to start on page 25, Lauren, slide that's called Introduction. That's it. Thank you. So we're under a requirement to publish an annual monitoring report. As the name suggests, it's done annually and it monitors a couple of things. The first is to record progress made on preparation of local plan documents. So that's a sort of process, if you like. Where are we in the stage of preparing local plans? When do we expect to get to examination? What's been adopted and so on? That all goes in the annual monitoring report. And then perhaps more importantly, in my mind, how are current local plans performing against a range of specific indicators? So when we write a local plan document, policies require things to happen. How do we know that those policies are being successful? Are they doing what we anticipated they should do or not? And if they're not, what would we do about it? And how would we like to change our policies to make sure they're being effective? So those reports are done once a year. They look backwards to the previous year. So they're done between March and April in the year that's just gone. There are, I think, probably 50 or 60 indicators, that measures that we measure each year. Rakesh produces a report, some of them more interesting than others. What you've got on the screen in the presentation is largely focused on housing related monitoring information, but we do monitor things like employment land take-up rates, the environmental condition of various sites. Sometimes we record things like public transport, sort of contextual sort of stuff, what's going on in the district. The intention would be that if you read an annual monitoring report and things appear to be going wrong, you should be asking yourself the question, well, what are we going to do about it? That's why you go through that process each year to look at what you're doing and see whether you should be doing something else. So that's what an annual monitoring report is. Next page, Lauren. So yeah, it's mainly about housing. And I'm going to start with a sort of headline figure that's at the bottom of that page. Total permissions granted, 175 dwellings. That probably means very little to you unless you know what that figure should be. You know, what are we generally looking at in terms of housing delivery? The current core strategy requires us to deliver 400 dwellings a year. So you can see 175 is not 400. We're not talking about dwelling completions here. We're talking about permissions granted. But permissions granted translate at a future date into dwellings built. This is a really low number. I think it might well be the lowest number I can remember, and I've been here for more than 20 years. So it's a really poor figure. And it's a consequence of two things, neither of which are a secret. The first is nutrient neutrality. We've not granted a planning permission, or we've not granted many planning permissions for new dwellings in the district, because to do so would be unlawful unless they mitigate their impacts in terms of nutrient pollution. So I think, I don't know, and Russell might know the latest figure, but last time I looked, we had 1,400, 1,500 dwellings in the pending pile that we were unable to determine because of the impacts of nutrient neutrality. So you can see once that pile is worked through, this figure would start to go up again. So that's the first impact, is nutrient neutrality. The second one is the fact that the site allocations in the current development plan are now largely consented. So all of the big sites that would normally go into this number now have planning permission or had planning permission some time ago, and quite a few of them, most of them, are actually built. So if you haven't got large sites coming forward, you are dependent on small developments, 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, barn conversions and so on to make up this total. So I would predict that that number 175 is going to be not dissimilar next year and possibly the year after, because those two issues, nutrient neutrality and the lack of bigger sites until the new local plan is adopted, are going to be with us for a little while longer. So I don't see an immediate sort of turnaround very, very quickly. And that obviously has an impact elsewhere in terms of how do you demonstrate 5-year land supply moving forwards. If you're not granting consents, at some point you're not going to be building houses. And if you're not building houses, you're not going to be able to demonstrate how you've got your 5-year land supply in order. The other figure in there is the 24 affordable dwellings. The target corporately is to try and deliver 100 affordable houses a year. Two mechanisms for delivering that: the Rural Exceptions Programme and affordable houses built as a percentage of market development schemes. Both of those have not done very well in the last year. Affordable housing is captured by nutrient neutrality, the same as other types of development. That again, 24 affordable dwellings in a year against a target of 100 is clearly not very good performance. The other thing worth noting on this screen is the importance of other sources of houses other than new build dwellings. The new build dwellings, 117, it's obviously a big chunk of new housing in the district, but don't underestimate the importance of barn conversions, changes of use, removal of restrictive occupancy conditions, all those sort of smaller 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s across the district actually deliver a substantial proportion of the homes that are required. In some years, more than half of new homes in the district come on sites which are not allocated for development. So that general sort of churn through of sites is a significant contributor to housing delivery. Any questions before we move on to the next slide? I'm going to repeat some of this, I think, later.
Mr. President.
Thank you, Chairman. Mark, you mentioned the 5-year land supply. Are the council not at risk of a predatory application?
So what happens when you don't have a 5-year land supply? So let's just say we're required to deliver, let's make the maths easy, 500 dwellings a year. You need 2,500 houses to demonstrate a 5-year land supply. And the test is those 2,500 houses have to have a reasonable prospect of being delivered. So they're not a fanciful idea that somebody's made up. They are permissions which are going to translate into houses in the 5-year period that you're recording. And if you don't have that 5-year land supply in place, what happens is national guidance says apply the presumption in favour of sustainable development. So at that point, you're open to landowners, promoters, developers making planning applications on unallocated development sites. And the test as to whether you will grant those unallocated development sites is that development nevertheless sustainable? So it's not an open season. It doesn't say grant planning permission everywhere. It says grant planning permission for those developments which are nevertheless sustainable, even if they're not in your development plan. And that does open up the prospects of, I think you described it as sort of predatory applications, unwelcome applications, applications on sites which are not allocated. And the council having to basically say, well, we need to grant that planning permission. It's sustainable development and it tops up our land supply position. Now, to date, we've not had many of those proposals, but there is clearly in publishing a position that says we don't have a 5-year land supply at the moment. You are signalling the opportunity for applications to be made elsewhere, essentially.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Toy, then Councillor Dixon. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to add two quick observations. Mr. Ashwell referred to a number of homes. In terms of applications, we've got just over 140 currently sat in the system, effectively held up for nutrient neutrality. So that's going to be interesting, in inverted commas, when the issue is resolved, however it is resolved. And we've then got to process them, many of which will need to come to development committee. So we'll clearly have to have some discussions around that. And then the second thing, just to the avoidance of doubt, is the nutrient neutrality issue doesn't relate to the whole of the district council area. It's just, in inverted commas, the Broads and the Wentham area. So there are parts of the district where, if I simplify, development is unaffected by this, but much of the district is affected.
And notably North Walsham is an accepted area as well.
Yeah, North Walsham, Edgecroma, that sort of bit.
So Councillor Toy and then Councillor Heinrich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, so actually one of them was just answered, so thank you. And then the other one was, what about the level of applications? Is that in a dip as well? Is that slowed? So we're not, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think some people are obviously mindful of the nutrient neutrality position and decided not even to make a planning application because the costs associated with preparing and making applications are significant. And why would you if you were just going to have your application sat in a pending pile? So I'm sure there are some where people are just deciding it's not even worth applying at the moment because there's very little prospect of securing permission.
So essentially the recovery is going to be slowed even further.
Yeah, there's a sort of but in there. So many of you will have heard of something called biodiversity net gain, which is the next thing coming around the corner where developments will have to be able to demonstrate, I simplify, 10% gain from a biodiversity perspective. Please don't ask me to explain how, why, what, etc. But this morning, tail end of last week, the government further clarified the implementation timeframe for that. So major applications should start to be affected from January and then everything else from April, I think it is. And they've clarified that that will be done in a manner where applications submitted after the implementation date will be affected. So you might possibly have the converse where people try and submit things before the implementation date because then they won't be caught to the same degree. But that's speculation on my part to a degree.
And there is a school of thought that GI RAMs, that biodiversity net gain, nutrient neutrality are all going to add development cost in the delivery of sites, and that's only going to have one impact on house prices, but that's for perhaps for another day. Councillor Heinrich.
Thank you, Chairman. Now, we're still in a bit of a cleft stick with the lack of 5-year housing and land supply, but then we can't have it because nutrient neutrality is impacting on the areas which can be developed. And yeah, I am concerned about predatory application. I think at least 2 sites in North Walsham where we might expect something in the next 12 months or so, hopefully not. So, appalling sites to develop. But do we know where we are with nutrient neutrality, when we might see some way out of it? Or are we stuck here for indefinite? I mean, there's going to be a change of government potentially next year, which will probably change the whole scenario again and no doubt delay any further changes. Who knows? But it'd be nice to know when we might be able to get back to some semblance of normality in terms of dealing with these larger applications. Thank you.
So broadly, there are 3 different types of ways out of this situation, in my opinion. Number one is probably not the overly professional words, but the government come up with a way of resolving the issue. And I'm sure many of you will have noticed that the government endeavoured to do that a month or so back via an amendment to a piece of legislation going through Parliament, but that was defeated in the House of Lords in that. So they were effectively introducing a bit of legislation which would, for all intents and purposes, have said nutrient neutrality goes away as an issue. Councils, you don't need to worry about it. That hasn't gone through, but that doesn't mean the government couldn't reintroduce that or something similar. And it will be interesting as to whether anything in that ilk features in the King's speech, which I think is due on early in November, which will set out the legislative programme for the next phase of Parliament. So that's one option. The second option is individual developers can try and sort it themselves. So can they come up with a mechanism which demonstrates that their development is nutrient neutral? Can they design the scheme in such a way? Can they provide mitigation in such a way? And a few are trying to do that, but it's not easy unless you own tons of land in addition to the bit you want to develop. And to be honest, we don't have a great track record of that being successful in big scale terms, which is almost illustrated by Mr. Ashwell's data here for that. And then the third element is, can we and or others design some kind of credit system? And we're participating in a joint venture across Norfolk to try and design this, where broadly speaking, developer X can develop site Y, but they buy some credits from a system which delivers compensatory benefits in the same catchment somewhere else. And it's a very positive concept, but it's one of those that's a darn sight easier to say than it is to find the land that is appropriate for those credits. And then the fourth alternative, I suppose, if there is a fourth one, is it may, which I think is where some of your concern comes in, focus development further into the areas which aren't affected by nutrient neutrality, because those are the ones where it might be possible to get going. So at the moment, there is a degree of wait and see what the government does here, and your politicians, your guess is as good as mine or as bad as mine.
Councillor Dixon, thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question really relates to the 5-year land supply, and just take that a little bit further, really. I think we all recognise the reason why we have that in the system, but I think just thinking through the impact of nutrient neutrality, I think the 5-year land supply by and large is there to ensure that we do all that we need to do to ensure that we have a 5-year land supply. In this particular case, we don't have a 5-year land supply, as I understand it, because of something which is outside of our control. And to that extent, I wonder what the view would be for any developer that might be minded to make use of that opportunity, if you like, to come in under the wire, and whether that would be successful, and how might that be tested outside of this organisation.
So when nutrient neutrality requirements were introduced, a number of authorities, including ourselves, were mindful of the impact on potential 5-year land supply issues. And we actually wrote to government at the time and said, if you stand behind the plan-led system, which you purport to do, you should disapply the presumption in favour of sustainable development for those authorities impacted by nutrient neutrality. Along the lines of your argument that it wasn't our fault, Governor, we've done everything that we can do, but external circumstances are resulting in us being in this position. And surely it would be better if the presumption were to be put on one side for a period whilst this issue is being addressed. And we wrote to government in those terms, and the reply wasn't positive, put it that way. In fact, I'm not sure we actually got a reply. I'm not sure whether I saw a reply, but that fell on, I'm going to say it fell on deaf ears as an idea. There is still the local decision that you can make when you are pressed on this and you have an unwelcome planning application. It is for you to determine to what extent you apply the presumption and what reasons you might give for not applying it. Now, I wouldn't want to try and preempt that discussion now, but there would be, in my mind, a set of circumstances where you might say, well, locally, we feel in relation to this particular proposal, there are good grounds to resist it, notwithstanding that we don't have a 5-year land supply position. And that would be tested through the conventional route with section 78 planning appeal. And you would want very detailed advice about what circumstances might lead you to make that decision, including the implications in terms of costs, because you would be sticking your neck up above the parapet, knowing that government had already decided nationally not to disapply the presumption. So it would be a difficult area to be in. And probably would bring in all sorts of considerations about the timing around the local plan. How long is it? How big is the gap for a 5-year land supply to be demonstrated? Are we talking about a deficit of 50 dwellings or 500 dwellings? Does this proposal fill this gap or partially fill this gap? How long will it be until the local plan is in place and that gap will be resolved? Would all be things that you might take into account when you were making that decision about whether you not disregarded the presumption, but gave less weight to various considerations than you might otherwise do in favour of protecting the plan-led system. You'd have to look at each individual proposal, I think, and be very cautious about taking such a bold step without getting, pretty detailed advice about it. I think that's probably fair.
Yeah, that's entirely fair, but I think there's 2 additional bits. So this council actually has had a very positive track record of appeal decisions recently on particularly small proposals for 1 or 2 dwellings where the appellant has made the point you don't have a 5-year land supply, therefore, and I'm grossly oversimplifying it, but therefore our proposal should be allowed. And we've got a strong bank of evidence where inspectors have actually said, sort of conversely, position of actually 1 won't make much difference. What's the point? If it's not acceptable, then why would we suddenly approve it just because you'd get 1 to go to your bigger gap? I think you are going to get at development committee 2 or 3 cases in this area in the coming months, which are outside the nutrient neutrality zone, which might be in the 3-figure territory, where developers are likely to be making the point that A, it's outside the nutrient area, and B, it would help with your 5-year land supply. I happen to be the case officer for both applications, 1 on the edge of Cromer, 1 on the edge of North Walsham. Well, actually, there's 2 at the edge of North Walsham, but it's the same site. And both of those are likely to be interesting at development committee in some of the areas you're talking about, Councillor Dixon. And the points Mr. Ashwell raised will need to be set out in the report. And that's not me leading to a positive or negative recommendation or decision, but we are, as a council, going to have to start facing up to some of these challenging decisions in this area in the not too distant future.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's helpful actually, because for me, it isn't a black and white. There are shades of grey in there, and to me, it's important that the motives of the developer and the motives of the planning authority would be key in determining what kind of proportionality you would apply in resolving that application. And I think basically what you're saying is that where there is substantial justification for taking that particular line, whether it be to approve or whether it be not to approve, you've got the evidence there that will withstand the test of others. So I think that that's a useful thing to bear in mind, because I think, as we've just heard, that there may be occasions when we may be tested in that regard. So thank you.
I think just before you come back in, Matt, I think a couple of points there occurred to me. Firstly, our core strategy was introduced in 2008, and that has been tested obviously over a long period of time in terms of appeals in relation to planning policies within the core strategy. And it has stood up very well in the appeal process, as Mr. Williams has mentioned, which is testament to our planning policy making in the district. We, earlier in the year, as we know, kept our heads when other local authorities were losing theirs in terms of bringing forward the new emerging local plan. That will no doubt feed into the thinking of anyone wishing to bring an appeal against this council, that our track record is very good. We've got the emerging local plan, and our development committee is pretty competent, let's face it, when it comes to making decisions. We know that because we lose very few appeals. We're well within the tolerance required nationally. And I've said this before and I'll say it again, some district councils not too far away from here will be pretty envious about our appeal record. If I can
I wasn't going to continue this discussion. I was going to move on to the next slide. I will just make one further remark. I nearly heard you sigh then, Russell.
It's your imagination, Mr. Ashwell.
The appeal track record has been good, largely on the 1s and 2s and 3s, the small scale stuff, in the non-selected settlements. So where policy says this growth would be unsustainable. So when you went back to the presumption is only in favour of sustainable development. So, you know, clearly if you've got a settlement hierarchy and a strategy that says don't put lots of dwellings in the countryside for perfectly good reasons, you should expect that argument to stand up even when you don't have a 5-year land supply, because those locations are still unsustainable. It doesn't alter the radar in terms of the measure of sustainability. It just says release more sites in those locations which are sustainable. So there's a very clear difference in my mind between 50 houses in a village, 50 houses on the outskirts of Cromer, and 50 houses on the outskirts of Cromer on a site that's about to be allocated in a local plan. Those are 3 distinct and quite different sets of circumstances that should inform the decision on those applications. So I think, you know, we do perform well on appeals, but it's largely because those appeal proposals represent unsustainable growth, and therefore the presumption shouldn't apply to them anyway. Next slide. Yeah. The last slide was about planning permissions granted. This is a similar set of statistics on actual building, and the story is not dissimilar. Dwellings actually built 314. Now, to give you some comparison, the last 3 or 4 years, we've been hovering around about sort of 450, 480, 500. So that figure is sliding downwards, and I would expect it to continue to be low. Rakesh does a sort of annual sweepstake on what the number might be next year, and I'd be surprised if it's above 314. It's probably going to fall further, simply because we're not replenishing the planning permissions. Those that can be built out are being built out, and eventually the pot runs dry. Similar statistics there about the breakdown of new build and other types of development. Make the same point again, you know, it's not all about new build houses on housing estates in North Norfolk. A lot of growth comes from those other sources. Next slide. This just shows the breakdown between permissions and completions, and how permission 1 year doesn't immediately necessarily translate into a completion the next. And you'll see on here that the numbers of planning permissions, the blue, is routinely above the numbers of dwellings built. And there's not necessarily a correlation between the two. The very high blue bars, for example, might relate to, say, a planning permission for 700 or 800 houses at Fakenham that might not appear on the ground for another 5 or 6 years after they've been given planning permission. So it's not an immediate direct correlation between permissions granted this year and dwellings appearing next year. There's often quite a big lag, particularly on the bigger development sites. Overall, planning permissions get converted into dwellings bar about a 10% lapse rate in the district. So if you grant planning consent, eventually that dwelling does appear in the system at some point, but about 10% for one reason or another don't happen at all. Site gets developed for something else, or the landowner has a change of heart or whatever. But in the main, planning permissions granted appear as dwellings in the system 2, 3, 4, 5 years after they get their planning consent. Next slide. Can't read that from here, but it tells you the same story about the different sources of supply and what's been happening. So each of those clusters of bars are a different type of dwelling, source of dwelling. So start on the far left, just to illustrate the point. That's conversions, barn conversions. You'll see the trend is upwards. So actually, I'm getting more and more barn conversions in the district, despite people saying, you know, you're going to run out of barns eventually to convert, they've all gone. The number of conversions of buildings is increasing, probably in part due to the more relaxed national legislation around what they call Part Q, conversion of agricultural buildings into dwellings, is now much more permissible than it was 5, 6, 7 years ago. So that's delivering more houses. Whereas at the other end of the scale, the new build completions are on a downward trajectory for the reasons that I previously explained. I don't think we need to go into any more detail on that. Next slide. So this is looking forward. So we've mentioned the local plan earlier on. So orange bars on this chart, they're built houses, they're done, they've got people living in them. The remainder of the graph, the blue, the red and the greens are our projection as to what happens in the future after the local plan is adopted. And the significance of this is the horizontal line is the running rate that's required to be delivered. So you can see once the local plan is adopted, then there's, well, as you'd expect there should be, there's more than a fighting chance that each year we will deliver sufficient dwellings, particularly over the next 5, 6, 7 years. So that reflects the fact that once the local plan is adopted, the larger development sites become available, short delay to get planning permissions and acquire the land and all the other stuff that has to go on. And then you start seeing significant numbers being delivered again for the next 7, 8, 9 years before we get back to where we are now, where what's in the new local plan is built out and somebody's preparing another plan. So that just shows the various sources of housing supply by the different colours in each bar. So the story there is we need to press on and get the local plan adopted. Essentially, once the local plan is adopted, the 5-year land supply position improves quite dramatically. Currently stands at about 4 years, a bit more than 4 years land supply. When the local plan is adopted, it goes up to 6.5 years land supply for the next 6, 7, 8 years. And we shouldn't be having thinking about absence of 5-year land supply once the local plan gets adopted. Any questions just before? All right. That's what happens if the local plan doesn't get adopted. So you can see the importance of the local plan in terms of reinforcing the supply is really critical. There's a little bump there for 3 or 4 years, which is building out permissions and allocations that are already in the system. But sort of 2 or 3 years from now, if you didn't have a local plan in place, you would be really struggling. You'd be delivering very, very low numbers of dwellings year on year, and the authority would be overrun with applications on unallocated sites at that stage. So again, just reinforces the importance of getting the plan through the system. Next slide. This comes up sometimes. We monitor housing types, what's actually getting delivered. And it's sometimes said developers tend to build larger houses. Well, actually, when you take it across the board, significant numbers of dwellings built in the 1, 2 and 3 bedroom categories, they still represent the majority of new build. I would say probably not as a consequence of the local plan. I think it's probably market conditions, and that is just where the market is. And I suspect these figures would look like this, even though we have a local plan that requires a particular housing mix. We rarely get pushback on it from the bigger volume house builders. They largely are able to meet our different percentages of different types of units. Where it doesn't work particularly well is on smaller sites. If a small site of say 5 or 6 dwellings, asking a developer to build 1 1-bedroom unit, 2 2-bedroom units and 3 3-bedroom units tends to get a bit difficult and problematic on smaller sites. But on the bigger sites, in the main, the mix stands up reasonably well against our policy requirements. Paul's got a question there.
Councillor Heinrich, it's a brief.
Thank you, Chairman. Do we have any mapping to show where the 4 and 5 bed houses are mainly located? I have my suspicions, but
I think Rakesh could probably do you a map, or certainly could break these figures down by parish, because they're all held as individual consents. Be a little bit of work in it, but if you're interested, I think we could give you a mix. Maybe in the larger towns might be sort of thing that you're looking for.
I'm thinking more of probably Holes and the coastal towns. There's large retirement properties, perhaps, and not necessarily in North Walsham or Fakenham. But I'd just be interested to see how that spread is across the district.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that away as a separate task. Break this down and do something on either parishes or larger towns, or coastal versus rural, however you want it split. Well, we'll do a couple of extra graphs and circulate it around generally. Yep.
So
Sorry.
it's like listening to Test Match Special, isn't it? It's like saying to Andy Saltzman on Test Match Special, can you magic up a stat about this, that, and the other? I think we're in danger of losing Rakesh to Test Match Special if Andy Saltzman ever resigns. But there you go.
Next one, Lauren. Right. It's really just a reminder. So the new local plan has got a policy in it which obviously lays out where development is going to go in the district and how much of it there is. This table, I can't read it from here, but this table gives you a breakdown of the distribution of growth across each of the selected settlements in the district in each tier, and clearly shows the story that in the higher, what I call higher order settlements, the large growth towns, they are receiving 40-45% of total growth, and then the proportions get smaller and smaller as you get down to some of the smaller villages. The nature of the challenge is the new local plan is going to have to deliver somewhere between 10, 11, maybe even 12,000 dwellings, depending on where the inspector ends up with a final housing target. So it's a major task. We're moving into an area where I suspect we're routinely going to have to be looking at delivering close to 500 dwellings a year. At the moment, we could probably manage with sort of 400, 450 per year and keep up with the target. Definitely the new local plan has got a more, let's call it more stringent target, a higher target to be met, and that's obviously going to make it slightly more difficult to do.
Councillor Punchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What would be quite useful, if possible, would be to see those windfall development statistics pinned against each bit. So where you've got large growth towns, 40%, maybe in brackets, what percentage is windfall? Because I know certainly speaking for Fakenham, we've had quite a good success on windfall developments. which sort of backs up your stats sometimes when you're talking to local residents, etc., to put them against those areas rather than just a separate category.
Yep, we can make that clear. The totals for the towns and the settlements are totals including allocations and windfall. So they're all in. The windfall allowance in the table is everywhere else that isn't a selected settlement. So, you know, a windfall would be a barn conversion or a rural exceptions development or a one-off proposal in the countryside that gets planning permission. They're recorded as a separate line. But the figures to the right are total growth per settlement, including windfall allowances.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you.
But we can separate those out if it would be interesting to show those separately.
The windfall would be, thank you.
Next slide. So off of housing, I'll speed this up a little bit now. So population, the main story here, we've said it lots of times, growth in population is at the older end of the age spectrum. Two things are influencing that. We're all very old already and getting older. We live here. We will appear in next year's statistics will be a year older than we are. And then lots of people that come into the district are already of retirement age or close to retirement age. And those who are young are going in the opposite direction and going somewhere else. So over the next 5, 10, 15 years, this trend will continue. We will get an older and older and older population in North Norfolk. That leads directly to one of the policies in the local plan that requires house builders to build more accommodation suitable for elderly people. So alongside our housing mix policies on 1, 2 and 3 bedrooms, we've also got policies about age specialist types of accommodation on all of the larger allocations to reflect this bump in old people in North Norfolk. That will disappear off the end of the chart eventually. So we might get into a period in 20 or 30 years' time where actually the population will even out a little bit, but probably it will continue to be influenced by inward migration at that point anyway, and that inward migration will still be, you know, for retirement rather than for economic reasons, I suspect. Just the nature of the population in North Norfolk. Next one. Sorry, there was a question over this side.
Sorry. Councillor Holiday.
I mean, there was a which look at best places to retire in the UK, and we weren't listed in it, so perhaps that trend will change. Best places, the Outer Hebrides, I think.
This just presents much the same information, but gives you the comparisons with elsewhere, and you can see that North Norfolk, you know, it's not just that everybody everywhere is getting older. North Norfolk is getting older at a faster rate than everywhere else. We're amongst the sort of national, you know, if you did a league of elderly people, we would be close to, if not at the top of it in terms of the proportion of old people in the district. And that trend, as I say, is going to continue for some time. Next one. I'm not going to refer to the slide here. So this is about house building, new house sales prices and the relationship to local incomes. And the most important figure is the one down the bottom in red, the 11.44. That is the ratio which compares average house price to average incomes in the lower quartile of both things. So if you're on low wages and you're buying a starter home, it's that comparison that's important. You now need 11.44 times your income to buy a starter home in the lower quartile of properties. That number has been going upwards for the last 3 or 4 years. It was actually fairly static for quite a while. It ran at about 8, 8.5, 8.2, 8.3, something like that for a while. And then it's taken this sort of rapid jump up. Two things have obviously happened. Average earnings have remained largely static for the last 5 or 6 years. House prices have been going upwards quite rapidly for the last 5 or 6 years. So you would expect that ratio to go in the wrong direction and housing to become less and less affordable. There might be a factor in there associated with the pandemic where a lot of people went down to 80% of their earnings rather than 100% of their earnings, and that might have appeared in this figure and resulting in a step up. And things have gone slightly the other way in the last few months. Wages have increased and house prices have started to fall. So this figure might have peaked. We might expect this to start dropping back a little bit in the next year or 18 months. But I suppose the key message is the affordability ratio is likely to stay probably well above, let's say 7.5, 8. I don't see any prospects of it moving dramatically. So the story behind that is always likely to be houses in North Norfolk are not likely to be affordable to buy because of the operation of the market, essentially, which underpins why we ask for lots of affordable housing from market house builders when they build properties. Any questions about that at all?
Councillor Dixon.
That figure of 11.44 is very, very interesting, and I'm just wondering how we compare with other areas.
I'm going to say we're nowhere near the top. We're nowhere near the top. If you look at London boroughs, Chelsea, and places like that, no surprise that this figure would be probably above 20. I think when I did look at it, I would say we were probably we weren't much above halfway up the league table, I don't think. So when you look at it, this figure nationally, nearly everybody produces a number which is above four times your income. Across the country, everybody would have a number above 4 or 5. I think we're at about 65-70%, somewhere in there if you look at the sort of league. So we're nowhere near the top, but we're above the middle. Last time I looked at it. Next slide. Okay, so this is the last one. So there was a focus there on housing permissions, housing generally, and population. The AMR generally will have lots more indicators in it. Rakesh will put together figures, or is putting together figures on all of these other areas. Second home ownership's interesting, employment land take up, what's happening in town centres in terms of change of use of shop units, how many shops are being closed each year, what the building is being used for, that sort of thing. All that sort of stuff goes into each year's report, so you can compare to the previous year. So I think the recommendation just says that we basically complete the work and publish this on the website. It's factual information. There's no policies in it, not asking you to make any decisions, just bringing it to you for general information and to note that it'll be published shortly.
Any questions or comments before we move on? Councillor Toy?
Yeah, just to thank Rakesh for the work that he puts into this and the stuff is delivered. So thank you.
Yes, I'd like to endorse what you just said, Councillor Toy. Thank you, Rakesh, for all your work. There's a tremendous amount of work goes into this, and the information that Rakesh puts together is relied upon across a number of departments in the council. So it's excellent work that you do. So thank you very much for that. Much appreciated. I don't think we need to vote on this because it's just for noting, isn't it? Am I right on that?
Yeah, the officer's recommendation is that members note the content of the report.
Right. So
If members have, obviously in reporting, members have noted the report and sat through the presentation.
yes, very ably presented by Mr. Ashwell as well. Right, so I think there was nothing else to do on that particular item, is there? I don't think. So we move to the final item, which is exclusion of press and public. don't see any unless they're hiding under the desks at the back, which I don't think they are. So I think, do you want to just pop back and say something about the previous?
I did, earlier on in the meeting, I misinformed you about something which I'm now going to correct and it should go into the minutes. So I said the Blakeney neighbourhood plan included local resident restrictions on the allocated site in Blakeney, or implied as much. It doesn't. The local lettings restrictions applies to all affordable housing delivered in the village, other than that proposed on the allocation in the local plan. And I don't think I said that first time round. I think I said the reverse. So I just wanted to record that as a correction.
Thank you very much for that correction. Right, so I don't think we have any other businesses, anything that you want to mention when we sign off is at the end of the meeting? Yeah, okay. And the Assistant Director of Planning, Mr. Williams?
Well, just to draw councillors' attention, because you talked about it at your last working party, that the Glaven Valley Conservation Area re-consultation, for want of a better phrase, started on Friday and runs for 3 weeks till the 27th of October. So communication has sort of started to go out over the weekend.
Thank you very much for that. How could we possibly forget the Glaven Valley Rural Conservation?
I suspect you haven't forgotten, Chair.
That's what's going
on.
There's a touch of pushback that's quite short and it won't include some people's parish meetings. Therefore, they will find it difficult to respond.
Okay, if it doesn't include, as I'm sure you're right, councillor, some parish meetings and the clerk or chair wishes to get in touch, then we could have a chat about whether there is scope for, whenever the scheduled meeting is, to be factored in. Having said that, we don't want to delay the whole thing for some time. I know there is a keenness to see it brought back here and then to cabinet before Christmas, if at all possible. But by all means, get in touch if anybody has any particular challenges with the dates.
I wouldn't want to gainsay what people's reaction will be to the latest amendments, but I would be surprised if there is any real significant challenges to the amendments, because we have taken into account what was submitted over an extended period of consultation from November 21st to March 31st, if memory serves, earlier in the year. So this is actually, if you like, an optional extra, but we do like to be transparent and consult with our communities as much as we possibly can. But if we did it to the nth degree, I'm afraid
I totally take that point.
we
But
wouldn't have a designation anytime soon. We are hoping to complete it before the end of the calendar year. But the point you make is very well made, Councillor Holiday. Right, okay, well, I think we can call the meeting closed at 11:12, I think it is, and you can return to your